that mission. It normally doesn't happen overnight. You don't go, here's our mission, and then the next day you're doing something completely different. Normally it's over months or years or decades that an organization started with this mission and is quite unrecognizable years later. I've personally benefited greatly from the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, but they would be an example, in my opinion, of mission drift. The YMCA started as an organization that had the mission of leading young men to Christ through athletics and recreation, but today is more of a Judeo-Christian organization to improve communities through recreation access. Quite different. Churches can start out with a mission of making disciples, glorifying God by making disciples, or glorifying God by pursuing gospel transformation, which is our mission, but over years and years and years can become, let's have an offering for everything, for every family to grow as big as we can and increase our budget as much as we can. Now, the mission statement on the website is probably the same, but over time, mission can drift. An individual, you could have one day gone, man, I want to give my life to helping as many people know Jesus as possible. But then decades later, you're going, I want to have the nicest yard on the block. I want to retire comfortably. Our mission can drift. That's why one of our core values at Sojourn is missional intentionality. Why intentionality? Because we have to be intentional not to drift. Here's what it says on our website under missional intentionality: taking the gospel where we live, work, and play. It says this: we believe every Christian is to live on mission, so we want to encourage and equip every believer to be a light where they live, work, and play. We want to build a church culture that is outward focused rather than simply trying to keep each other happy. And this ambassador sermon series that we're preaching is part of that. It's part of encouraging and equipping us to stay on mission. From time to time, someone in the church, maybe someone who's been a member for a while, will come up to me and ask a question. They'll say, what is our strategy for reaching our community? What is our church growth strategy? Well, we do some stuff. We're intentional in some ways. Every Sunday I seek to preach very intentionally using language that someone who has not grown up in church, does not claim to be a Christian, can still understand. That's something I put intentional effort into. You'll notice that whenever we sing any words that are kind of churchy and highly theological, we seek to define on the screen so that someone who's coming who does not know theological Christianese can still know what's going on. That's intentional. We have 2 or 3 big events a year, some men's events, some women's events, so that you can invite friends who maybe not are going to come on a Sunday morning. Maybe they need a different avenue to become a part of the church. So we do some stuff. We partner with ministries like Abba House and Caring Solutions and Out of Darkness that seek to preach the gospel in our community. But if you ask me, what is our mission strategy? My answer is this: you. To encourage and equip you to take the gospel where you live, in your neighborhood, where you work, to your coworkers, where you play, in your social clubs and children's recreational clubs, and everywhere that you go. We're a church of somewhere between 130 and 140 members. Our mission strategy is every Sunday to send missionaries out into the community. Every Sunday to encourage and, by God's grace, hopefully equip and send you out into neighborhoods, send you out into sports leagues, send you out into grocery stores, send you out into schools where you study or teach, send you out as missionaries with the best news ever to share with our community. Our mission strategy is us. And so again, that's what we're taking 3 weeks in the month of May to focus on through a sermon series called Ambassador. Let me, in case you're just joining us for the first time or in case you have forgotten, let me catch you up on where we are in this series. We're studying Acts 26, where the Apostle Paul is giving a defense before a governor named Festus and a king named Agrippa. He's been arrested And the new governor Festus doesn't really know Jewish law and custom, so he asked King Agrippa, who does know Jewish law and custom, to come and hear what Paul has to say. And Paul begins to share his testimony and begins to share how Jesus got a hold of his life and called him. And his focus is on why he is sharing the gospel and proclaiming what he's proclaiming. And so the first sermon focused on what is the goal of evangelism. Evangelism is a theological churchy word that means to seek to persuade others to trust in Jesus. And Paul says it's because through evangelism, through proclaiming the gospel, this was the first sermon, God opens blind eyes. He helps people to turn from darkness to light, to turn from the power of Satan to God, to receive the forgiveness of sin, and to receive a place and belonging. And so that's what we talked about the first week, is why Jesus calls his followers to be ambassadors. That's the goal. And then after Paul shares the gospel and shares his testimony, we see that the governor Festus goes, Paul, you've lost it. You got some loose marbles, you going crazy. He literally says, you are out of your mind. Paul then says, no, I'm speaking true words. Jennifer just read it for us. He goes, I'm speaking true words. These things have not happened in a corner. Jesus' life, Jesus' teachings, Jesus' miracles, Jesus' death for sinners, Jesus' resurrection. It didn't happen in a corner. It's historically accurate, and biblically it makes sense. Then Agrippa interrupts and he goes, Paul, you trying to convert me? You think you're going to convert me to be a Christian this quickly and this easily? And Paul goes, I don't care if it's fast or it takes a while, but I hope that you and everybody else here becomes a Christian like I am, except without these chains, because he's imprisoned. And so, in the second sermon, what I tried to do was take some common excuses or common reasons that we struggle to share the gospel, and from Acts 26, address them. A common thing I hear is, man, people are going to think I'm crazy. They'll think I'm radical. And we said, yeah, just like Festus said, Paul, you've lost your mind. Yes, people will sometimes think we're crazy and radical. Number two, we don't truly believe the gospel. Sometimes we share to proclaim our faith because we don't have faith to proclaim. But Paul says, no. These things I'm speaking are rational and true words. They didn't happen in a corner. I sought to strengthen our faith and our confidence in the gospel. Number three, we said it's not a common excuse. This is not true. A common excuse. It's not loving to force my beliefs on others. Well, I agree with that if by force you mean like violence or threat. But it is loving to seek to persuade and to proclaim the good news. Paul in 2 Corinthians 5, which we'll read later, he says, we implore you, we beg you, be reconciled to God. It is loving to give people the news that they most need. And then number four, we said it's emotionally exhausting to care about the eternal well-being of others. Oh, it's so much easier to have 1,000 hobbies and become obsessed with trivial things so that we don't have to wrestle in prayer and in our hearts with eternal matters and other people's souls. But we declared from 2 Corinthians 5 that Jesus did not die on the cross so that we can become obsessed with trivialities. He died on the cross to reconcile us to God and to give us the message of reconciliation. And so that catches us up to today. I just preached 2 sermons in 9 minutes. I'm pretty impressed with myself. And I went to Disney. Amen. There you go. All right, today my goal is to just add one more excuse or one more struggle that we have, conclude this ambassador series, taking Acts 26 as the main text, but really branching out to other scriptures that from the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul. And here's the excuse, or here's the fear of rejection. So often we can shy away from sharing our faith because we fear rejection. So I'm going to seek to give us 3 biblical reasons that we ought not let the fear of rejection dominate us or take our boldness from us, from Acts 26 and other letters from Peter and Paul. Have you ever thought, or have you ever heard others say, what if I seek to share the gospel, but then they ask me questions and I don't know the answers? As if it would be better not to proclaim it because I might not know the answers. Have you ever said, what if I mess it up? Maybe it's a subconscious thought. What if I seek to persuade someone to trust Jesus, but I say it wrong and then they never become a Christian? It's probably my fault. What if they reject the gospel and don't become Christians? And that thought can keep us from even taking the risk and loving enough to share in the first place. So 3 truths that I hope will, even though one of them is going to sound negative, I hope will encourage us, by God's grace, to persevere as ambassadors for Christ. Number 1, rejection is to be expected. Now, that doesn't sound like good news. But here's the thing. If no pastor tells you that, if you don't see it in the Scriptures, if no Christian tells you that, if that's not part of your discipleship, then you're going to get real excited, go out, share the gospel. Someone's going to say, I don't care, I don't want to hear it, get away from me. And you're going to go, oh, I don't know how to do this. I'll never do this again. But when you read the Scriptures, you're going to go, as ambassadors for Christ, we can expect some rejection. In a short time, Paul, would you persuade me to be a Christian? Paul, you've lost your mind. And then Paul says, yes, I want you to become a Christian like I am. And then what they do, they said, oh, then we believe. No, that's actually not what we read. They actually said, he hadn't done anything deserving death or imprisonment. If he wouldn't have appealed to Caesar, we'd have let him go. And that's all we read. Now, we have no clue whether Festus or Agrippa ever believed later in their life, but at least in this moment, it seems like the Apostle Paul shared the gospel and nothing happened. Went home, went to sleep, no party, no rejoicing. Went to the prison cell, went to sleep, not home. There was no obvious conversion. But then if you keep reading in the book of Acts, because he appealed to Caesar, he's on his way to Rome. You'll see a shipwreck in Acts 27. Then in Acts 28, he gets to Rome and he summons the local Jewish leaders. And here's what it says. He summons the local Jewish leaders and requests an opportunity to share the gospel with them. And look at Acts 28, 23 through 24. When they had appointed a day for him, they came to him at his lodging in greater numbers. From morning till evening, he expounded to them, testifying to the kingdom of God and trying to convince them about Jesus, both from the law of Moses and from the prophets. So he's trying all day to convince them because it's loving to implore. Remember, it's loving to persuade. But look what it says. And some were convinced by what he said, but others disbelieved. Some folks spent all day with Paul, with him opening up the Word and seeking to persuade them to trust Jesus, and they left going, nah, I'm good. Is anybody here prepared to say, well, it's because Paul ain't too smart. He couldn't answer their questions. You know, if he was a better evangelist. No. Some believed, some did not. How about Jesus? We just preached through the Gospel of Luke. In John 6, a different gospel, Jesus preaches the gospel. He says, I am the bread of life. And he preaches the gospel and he says some hard to understand things like, if you don't eat my flesh, you have nothing to do with me. But he's preaching the gospel, saying that he is the bread of life. And in verse 60, it says, when many of his disciples heard it, they said, this is a hard saying. Who can listen to it? And 6 verses later, it says, after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. When Jesus proclaims the gospel, people reject it. Is anybody prepared to say it's because he's just not smart enough? He just doesn't know the answers. No, here's what's going on. In 2 Corinthians 2, 14 through 17, the Apostle Paul helps us understand that as Christians, we are called the aroma of Christ. We smell, hopefully, like Jesus. But here's the thing. Paul says that to some, we will be the fragrance of death. Literally, it says you'll be the fragrance from death to death. But to others who are being saved, you'll be the fragrance from life to life. What changes? Not you, their sense of smell changes. I think I've got too much weight on this music stand. The hydraulics are not working. The difference is not you. The difference is their sense of smell. To some, we're going to be the fragrance of life. Oh my goodness, this smells so good. I want more of it. Others, the fragrance of death. If we fix our expectations and we realize that when the gospel is proclaimed, some are going to believe, some are going to hear good news, and some are going to completely reject it. Then when we share the gospel and when we feel some rejection, we're not surprised and we don't quit. So number one, from Acts 26, from Festus and Agrippa, we can see that we ought to expect some rejection. But number two, and this is really good news. Number two, proclaiming the gospel is win, win, win. Hopefully you'll understand what that means in about 5 minutes. Proclaiming the gospel is win, win, win. It is never a failure. Was it a failure in Acts 26 that the Apostle Paul shared his testimony in the gospel with King Agrippa and Festus? No. Was it a failure in Acts 28 that he opened up the scriptures with the Jewish leaders and some of them did not believe? No. God was not frowning on him because someone didn't believe when he proclaimed the gospel. What can happen when we proclaim the gospel? What are the options? Well, I can think of 3. Maybe you can think of more, but I can think of 3 biblically. The first thing that can happen is the person immediately believe and become a new creation and trust Jesus. The second thing that can happen is a seed is planted. A gospel seed is planted that will mature over time. And the third thing that can happen is rejection. Now, sometimes we don't know whether it's rejection or a seed being planted, but those are 3 things that could happen. Let me show you in the scriptures that those 3 things can happen. To do that, I want to go to 1 Corinthians 3, 5 through 9. If you're turning in your own Bible, you can make your way there. 1 Corinthians 3, 5 through 9. Now, what's going on in the church in Corinth so that we preach this in context? What's going on in the church in Corinth is factions. Groups of people in the church are attaching themselves to a certain leader, believing it makes them better than everybody else. We see this today. Even a silly example would be sports teams, college football or something. Somebody says, you know what? Well, I'm a fan of that team that always wins. And you're a fan of that team that always loses. Therefore, I'm better than you. Do you play? You're better than me because you bought the hat from Walmart? Like, what? And everybody knows when I say a team that always wins, everybody's like, yeah, Alabama. But our Alabama fans, I'm not saying you do this. I'm just using an example. But people in this culture, people in these churches, some are going, well, I'm with Paul. He preached the gospel first. I'm with him. That makes me better than you, Team Apollos people. And other people are going, man, when Paul preaches, people fall asleep and die. He's so boring. Have you heard the rhetoric of Apollos? He's a masterful with words. I'm with him. And here's what Paul comes up and says in his letter to this church. He says, what then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. Now the point in context, the main point is quit forming factions and attaching yourself to some leader as if it makes you superior to someone else.